Money in Canada is controlled by the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada was established in 1934, and the governor of the Bank of Canada in 2019 is a gentleman named Stephen Pawlenty. Now, the US also has a central bank. They call it the Federal Reserve. It operates very similarly to the Bank of Canada, and as of 2019, the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a gentleman named Jerome Powell. So we want to look at how the Bank of Canada, how the Federal Reserve operate. What is the purpose of this central bank? Well, there are 5 general purposes to a central bank, both in Canada and the US. The first is that the Bank of Canada is banker to commercial banks. Then they are controller of the money supply, banker to the federal government, manager of the country's monetary policy, and supporter of the fiduciary monetary system. So let's break these down and look first at what does it mean to be banker to commercial banks. So in Canada, we have chartered banks, and chartered banks, in order for them to exist, they have to report to the Bank of Canada. Now, because we have a fractional reserve banking system, we have target reserves, and target reserves have to be held with the Bank of Canada. So if we have a target reserve ratio of, say, 10%, then a chartered bank would have to keep 10% of its cash essentially in a savings account with the Bank of Canada. Now, what's the current target reserve ratio in Canada? Well, it's currently not 10%, it's 0%. Does that mean that the chartered banks hold $0 with the Bank of Canada? Well, they're not required to hold money with the Bank of Canada if the target reserve ratio is 0, but they will include the fraction of their reserve with the Bank of Canada. So you store some of your money with the central bank as kind of a security to a backup to hold some of your money. Now, if the chartered banks, if they run out of money, chartered banks can borrow money from the Bank of Canada. So we have what is called the overnight target rate and the bank rate. Both of these rates are set by the Bank of Canada, but the Bank of Canada wants to be lender of last resort to the chartered banks. So which one would be a lower interest rate? The bank rate, which is the rate at which these banks borrow from the Bank of Canada, or the overnight target rate, which is the rate at which banks borrow from each other. So the Bank of Canada sets the target for that overnight rate at which the banks borrow from each other. So if Royal Bank runs out of cash, they can borrow money from CIBC, another chartered bank. So if you want to be the lender of last resort as the Bank of Canada, which rate would you make lower? The overnight target rate or the bank rate? Well, you'd make the overnight target rate lower because you want the banks to borrow from each other first. So in fact, in November of 2019, the overnight target rate is 1.75%, and the bank rate is 2%. The bank rate is always 0.25% higher than the overnight target rate, so the banks will borrow from each other first before coming to the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada operates as a banker to these commercial banks by lending them money as well as holding their money. And they hold their money, we said, by having reserve requirements. So a certain amount of money has to be held at that central bank. All right. The second purpose of the Bank of Canada is to be controller of the money supply. So the Bank of Canada is really the only institution that's allowed to print money. So it's going to change the amount of coins and the amount of banknotes that are in circulation. Okay? So the challenge here is that if the Bank of Canada creates too much money in circulation, then the problem is that we now have tons of money chasing after the same goods. Well, how do you decide who gets the goods? It's whoever's willing to pay more. So the more money we have in circulation with the same number of goods, the more we're going to see inflation. Okay, but what if on the other extreme, we don't have enough money in circulation? So what if it's difficult for you to get a hold of cash? Well, if your company can't get a hold of the money it needs to operate, it's difficult to pay workers, and then they don't work for free. It's difficult to buy supplies or inventory. If people can't get a hold of cash, they don't spend. So it can be just as catastrophic to have too little money in circulation, because it will essentially crash your economy. You have to lay people off if you got to pay them because you can't get cash to do so, to buy things because there's not enough money going around. Then we don't need to produce, more people get laid off, and so on. So to have too little money in circulation as it is to have too much. And this job is to make sure that amount of money is just right. And for more information about the money, check out another video on this level. All right, the purpose of the Bank of Canada was first to be the banker to the commercial banks. The second was to be controller of the money supply. And the third is to be the banker. So when you pay taxes to the federal government, and it stores it in the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada is the bank for the federal. It is a fiscal agent. Fiscal. Okay. So the Canada is involved in the financial matters of the federal. The government needs to borrow money. Then the government issues a bond. Those government bonds we were talking about, and it sells those bonds to the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada sell them to you as investments. Your taxes go to the Bank of Canada as borrow money from the Bank of Canada. So the central bank is the banker to the federal government. The next role of the bank is to be the manager of the country's monetary. Sorry for the noise, my cat is playing with a bag. You need to go away. As manager of the country's monetary policy, Canada decides when to increase the amount of money in circulation and interest rates. Okay. Now, when it comes to managing the country's monetary policy, try to maintain a central bank that is in the federal government. So the governor is appointed for a 7-year term, and the idea with it being a 7-year term for the governor of the Bank of Canada is that they will span multiple prime ministers. Okay, they shouldn't be subject to a political party. They should be independent in their operation. Why would you want your to be independent of the federal government? Well, federal government that just decides, you know what, we're at war, and we're going to pay for that war by taking cash. Okay, that's not fiscally in the best interest of your country. So the idea is that determining in circulation and what interest rates are of the political whims of government. Now, one thing that's come up, whether or not they should really be politically separate. An article, the BBC, The Perils of a Political Federal Reserve. So Jerome Powell was chosen by Donald Trump to be the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and Trump did not like the previous, wanted her out. Her name was Janet Yellen, and he wanted someone to him and his policies to be in that position. There's an article from the BBC that talks about the Federal Reserve, or the central bank, our Bank of Canada, be political, or should it be separate? When it comes to Canada, the Prime Minister of the central bank is doing, the ministers can actually mandate change their policy. So while we try to operate separate, it is actually written on the books that head of the Bank of Canada by the federal government and can be removed by the federal. So far in the history of Canada, so we go back to the Bank of Canada 1834, that influence has never been exerted on government. It has been allowed to operate independently policy. So as you're working this on the assignment related to it, think about whether or not you would have head of your central bank be independent from the government. So they could be checks and balances, they can make decisions independent, or do you want there so that your monetary policy and your fiscal and government spending, so they align, is where your government is going to economy by lowering taxes, increasing government spending. At the same time, you have your bank raising interest rates and removing money from circulation, trying to get, you don't want them to go against each other. One of the challenges in the US is that you have a Federal Reserve, their central bank is trying to slow down an overheated economy. At the same time, you have a federal government trying to steal even more. So right now, they're working against each other. The reasons why: Trump wants more politically minded, someone who follows his policies, to be the head of the Federal Reserve. All right, so if the Bank of Canada or the central country's monetary policy, then they set, well, what interest rates do they set? They set the bank target rate. So let's take a look at these rates. Actually, before we dive into some graphs, let's go to the sources here. So the Bank of Canada has this, and you can see here the rate is 1.75%, and you can see there's to the prime rate here at 3.95%. Bank of Canada does not set the prime rate or the conventional mortgage rate. These rates change based on what the Bank of Canada does with rate and the bank rate. So Bank of Canada sets overnight target and bank rate. Themselves set prime and mortgage rates, but they're actually related to each other. Because the harder it is for your bank, Royal Bank for example, to get money, either by borrowing from the Bank of Canada or by borrowing from the Bank of Montreal, that's the overnight target rate, the harder to get money, the harder it will be for you to get money. So what we can see when we actually start to look at is that you can see that the prime rate and the overnight target rate move together. Now the Bank of Canada sets the overnight target rate. The bank rate is always 4% higher because they want to be the lender of last resort. And then the prime rate is set by, and it's based on the fact that it costs the bank money, it costs the bank to get money, plus the bank is out of that money for a period of time, plus that profit. That's the difference you see here. We can look in more detail. Here you go. Here's the overnight target rate at the bottom in red. In blue, 0.25% higher, and the prime rate up above. And you can see how they move to. So right now, that prime rate is sitting as of November 29.5. In comparison, the rate is 1.75% and the bank rate is at 2%. So you can almost 2% is that compensation to the bank, profit, and compensation for being without the money that they get from lending to you. Borrow, you probably don't pay prime. You may pay prime plus an additional percent is because of your credit risk. Maybe you don't have history, maybe you have poor credit, then you pay even more than that, more percentages. So you can see how they're all related. Right. Okay, so let's continue to look at what is the Canada. And so the last item here for the purpose of the Bank of Canada, order of the fiduciary monetary system. The idea of the monetary system is that fiduciary, that term means holding in trust. So it is the job of the Bank of Canada to create trust in our money. Faith that it will buy what you need it to buy tomorrow and face similar things a year from now, that it won't lose value. The people will continue to accept it. They're only going to accept our money if they're confident that it has value. So that the Bank of Canada's job is to ensure there's enough money in circulation and not losing value. We don't want people to be concerned that they're access to their money. And in fact, if we go back to the 1930s, people were in the Great Depression that they wouldn't be able to access their money, so they pulled it all out of the. And the problem is that the banks, because they lend money at any particular time, have everybody's money on hand. So if we all went to the bank to go get out, to pull everything out in savings accounts, the bank doesn't have, Royal Bank or whoever your bank is, cash on hand to pay the full amount of everyone's checking accounts. And so the idea is the Bank of Canada exists to prevent a run on the bank. So we get our money out of Royal Bank or BMO or whoever your bank was, then your bank, Royal Bank, could borrow money from the Bank of Canada to help meet that. So we're preventing a run on the bank where we all run to the bank and try to pull out money. The thing that the Bank of Canada does to ensure trust in the system is that your money. So we have the Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation essentially insures the money that is in your bank. It's a crown corporation, so what that means is that the government owns that company. And if you have your money in we talked about chartered banks in a previous level, or a previous video, money in a chartered bank, then that money is insured by CIBC $100,000 per account. So of course we probably shouldn't have more than $100,000 in a single bank account, insured up to $100,000. If you have $500,000 in a bank account, and let's say it's with Royal Bank goes bankrupt, you're only going to get $100,000 of your funds. So up to $100,000 per account. Now, what if your money not in a chartered, but let's say you have it in a provincially chartered bank, so Alberta Treasury Branch instead of Royal Bank. Well, then your money is insured by the province of Alberta. And in fact, banks that are not chartered banks can actually purchase CIBC insurance. Okay? And in fact, many of them purchase it from CIBC because they want to be competitive with those chartered banks. So if you have a near bank like Service Credit Union, your money is still insured, but your credit union is the one who's having to purchase the insurance, often through CIBC or from another source, because otherwise, why would you ever put your money into a Service Credit Union versus Royal Bank? Well, what if you are in the US? Well, the US has the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and it insures $250,000 per person per bank. So notice this is per person per bank, whereas in the US it's per account. So if you were in the US and you had more than $250,000, you'd want to have it in multiple banks. In Canada, if you have more than $100,000, you want to have it in multiple accounts. So if we just go back here to the beginning of our discussion, we can see the Bank of Canada is the banker to commercial banks, right? They're the lender of last resort. Those chartered banks put money into the Bank of Canada. They control the money supply, so they decide how much of the coins get minted, how many banknotes get printed. And what's interesting when we look at the number of banknotes and coins is that we use very little cash, and we looked before in a previous video how basically it's what 90 billion is our coins and our bank money there, which overall is 3 to 4% of all of the money in Canada. But one thing we have seen is a high usage of $100 bills. So we don't like cash, but we do like $100 bills. And so we have a number of banks trying to investigate why is it that we like $100 bills when we don't like other types of cash very much. All right, we said that the Bank of Canada is banker to the federal government, right? Your tax money gets stored with the Bank of Canada, and if the federal government needs to spend money it doesn't have, then it can issue bonds, and the Bank of Canada essentially is lending them the money by purchasing the bonds. Then we looked at how the Bank of Canada is manager of the country's monetary policy. They set interest rates. Which interest rates do they set? They set the bank rate and the overnight target rate. As we're wrapping up our discussion here and looking at some articles, it is interesting to note, this article here came out in 2018, talks about how Albertans would be hardest hit by interest rate hikes. And that's because we have a large amount of mortgage debt. And the big concern here is that, of course, if the Bank of Canada raises overnight target rates and bank rates, then the prime rates and the mortgage rates will go up as well, and then it becomes difficult for Albertans to be able to pay all that amount of money they owe on their houses. And finally, we said the Bank of Canada is a supporter of the fiduciary monetary system. It's the Bank of Canada that's got to create trust or faith in our system, ensuring that our money is going to be worth something today and in the future, because people aren't going to accept our money in exchange for goods and services if they can't trust it's going to be worth something.